The sun had just begun to sink behind the distant ridges, painting the sky with streaks of orange and red, when she stumbled through the underbrush, her breath sharp and ragged. The forest seemed endless, a maze of towering pines and tangled roots, shadows stretching long and dark as the evening deepened. Every crack of a twig beneath her boots made her heart jump, as if the woods themselves were whispering warnings she could not understand. She was hungry, tired, and utterly lost. She had wandered far from the trail, following a faint, winding path that had promised safety, but now offered only uncertainty. Each step seemed heavier than the last, the weight of hunger pressing on her chest like a stone. Her mind raced with memories of the small homestead she had left behind, the warm fire in the hearth, and the smell of bread baking. Now all that comfort was gone, replaced by the chill of the forest and the gnawing emptiness in her belly. She tried to steady herself, gripping a low branch for support, but the forest seemed to shift around her, the shadows lengthening as if to hide something waiting just beyond her vision. A distant cry, sharp and mournful, sent her spinning, eyes searching the tree line. It was nothing familiar, nothing human, yet it made her pause, rooted in fear and fascination alike. Then she heard the soft rustle behind her, careful and deliberate, as if something or someone was moving through the undergrowth with purpose. Her pulse quickened. She reached for a fallen branch, her only weapon, trembling as the sound grew closer. Out of the fading light, a figure emerged, a man unlike any she had seen. His skin was copper-toned, his eyes sharp and observant, and his movements silent and purposeful. A single feather hung from his dark hair, swaying with each careful step. The sight of him made her catch her breath. He looked every bit the warrior from the stories she had heard as a child, the kind that could move through the forest unseen, like a shadow stitched into the trees themselves. The warrior paused a few paces away, studying her with a quiet intensity. He made no sudden moves, yet the strength in his presence was unmistakable. He held a bow in one hand, the string strung tight, and a quiver of arrows rested across his back. His gaze softened when he noticed the thinness of her frame, the dirt smudged across her face, and the empty look in her eyes. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of survival, of shared solitude in the wild that neither had chosen, but both understood. "Lost," he said finally, his voice low but steady, carrying easily through the trees. She nodded, unable to find words that made sense. The forest had taken her voice, it seemed, leaving only fear and hunger to speak for her. He studied her for a moment longer, then, without another word, turned and moved deeper into the forest, glancing back to make sure she followed. She hesitated, unsure if she could trust him, yet instinct and desperation pushed her forward. The deeper they went, the darker the forest became. The light of the setting sun vanished behind the thick canopy, leaving a dim green twilight. Strange sounds echoed from all sides, the rustle of unseen animals, the snap of distant branches, the soft murmur of the wind through the leaves. She stumbled once, nearly falling, and he caught her arm with surprising strength, steadying her with a gentleness that contradicted the warrior's fierce appearance. She felt a flicker of safety, fragile as a candle flame, but enough to keep moving. After what felt like hours, they came to a small clearing. A fire burned low, smoke curling into the air in delicate spirals. The warrior knelt beside it, gathering dry wood with careful, practiced hands. He gestured for her to sit on a fallen log, and she obeyed, shivering from the cold that had seeped into her bones. He moved with ease, lighting the fire with a small flint, sparks leaping to life until a warm glow surrounded them. The warmth brought a moment of relief, though the forest still held its secrets in every shadow. "Eat," he said, handing her a small bundle wrapped in leaves. Inside were berries, dried meat, and a bit of bread. Simple, nourishing food, but enough to fill the hollowness that had consumed her. She looked at him with gratitude she could not speak, taking the food with trembling hands. As she ate, she noticed his eyes never left her, calm and watchful, as if he could see through more than just her form. There was a quiet wisdom there, born of the land, the hunt, and the countless nights spent under the open sky. The warrior did not ask why she was here or where she had come from. In that moment it seemed he understood without words. He merely sat nearby, tending the fire, his presence a steady anchor in a forest that had felt alive with threats just moments before. Night deepened around them, and the sounds of the wild became louder, more urgent. Wolves howled in the distance, and the wind carried the scent of pine and earth, a smell both comforting and wild. She wrapped herself in the thin blanket he had offered, trying to calm her racing heart. But she could not shake the feeling that the forest was watching, testing her, waiting to see if she could survive. As the fire crackled and cast flickering shadows across his strong features, she realized that her fate was no longer entirely her own. She had been wandering lost, alone and hungry, yet now a single presence changed everything. This man, this Apache warrior, had entered her life like a force of nature, unpredictable and commanding, and somehow, despite her fear, she felt drawn to the safety and strength he offered. But even as relief washed over her, unease lingered. She did not know the warrior's name, nor his intentions beyond helping her survive this night. And though the fire provided warmth, it could not chase away the questions pressing in her mind. Who was he really? Why had he come to her? And when morning came, would the forest once again turn against her, or would she find a new path alongside the man who had rescued her? The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a chill that promised the coming of a long night. She leaned closer to the fire, eyes fixed on the warrior, and realized that this encounter, this moment of fragile trust, was only the beginning. The forest stretched endlessly around them, filled with dangers she could not yet name, and with secrets he had yet to reveal. Her hunger and exhaustion were real, but so was the spark of hope he had ignited, a hope that perhaps she would not face the wilderness alone any longer. Somewhere beyond the trees, a branch snapped. She stiffened, heart pounding, and the warrior's hand went to his bow instinctively, his eyes narrowing in the dim light. The sound could have been nothing, or it could have been the first of many tests the forest had prepared. She realized then that survival was not just about finding food or shelter. It was about trust, courage, and the ability to read the world in ways she had never needed to before. And in that realization, she felt a shiver of fear and excitement, knowing that the journey she had stumbled into would change everything about her life, if she could endure the coming trials. The fire flickered once more, and in its glow she saw the resolve in his eyes. It was a silent promise, unspoken but clear. He would guide her through this night, through the forest, and perhaps beyond. Yet even as warmth returned to her bones, the uncertainty of what lay ahead pressed on her chest. The forest was vast, the night long, and the line between danger and salvation as thin as a thread. She took a deep breath, tightening her grip on the bundle of food, and watched the warrior move with quiet confidence, every step a reminder that she was no longer alone, but also that the path forward was uncertain. The wind picked up, rattling the trees, and a shadow moved just beyond the firelight. She flinched, but he did not. Instead, he stood, scanning the darkness with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her stomach tightened with anticipation, and she realized the night was far from over. The forest had not yet revealed its full secrets, and the man who had saved her, her protector, her unknown companion, was about to lead her into a world both dangerous and unforgettable. And in that moment she understood. Everything familiar was gone, and every choice from this point forward would shape the rest of her life. The forest grew darker as night pressed in from every side, and the fire between them flickered, casting uncertain shadows across the warrior's face. She watched him move with quiet precision, adjusting the bundle of kindling, checking the fire, and listening intently to the sounds around them. He seemed to belong to this place, as though the trees themselves obeyed him, while she felt every branch, every rustle, as if it were meant to trap her. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, but words felt fragile in the cold night air, and the weight of exhaustion made her tongue-heavy. Instead, she simply watched him, trying to understand what kind of man could move so silently through the darkness and yet command such presence. When the fire was steady, he finally sat down across from her. The way he looked at her was different now, less guarded, more curious. She noticed the lines in his face, the way his jaw tightened as he considered something unseen, the faint scars that traced along his arms and shoulders. They spoke of battles and survival, of nights spent in the wild under stars that burned cold and distant. For a moment, she thought she could imagine the life he had led, running through forests, tracking prey, navigating the dangers of the land with a skill born of necessity. But she also sensed another layer, something more private, buried beneath the strength and silence. "Where are you from?" she finally asked, her voice breaking slightly. The words felt heavy, and he studied her without answering immediately. He tilted his head, as if weighing the truth in her question against some unspoken code. She realized then that he did not move easily between worlds, between hers and his, and that trust would have to be earned, not demanded. "I am from the mountains," he said at last, his voice quiet but firm. "The land is my home, and the trees my family." There was a weight to the statement, a sense of permanence she could not yet grasp. She wanted to ask more, to understand his past, but the forest interrupted her curiosity with a new sound, a sharp snap in the distance, followed by a low growl that made her chest tighten. He moved instantly, hand reaching for the bow at his side, body coiled like a spring ready to launch. "Stay close," he warned. She nodded, stepping nearer to the fire, feeling the thin blanket of warmth, but also the chill that the unknown brought. The shadows shifted between the trees, and she realized how small and fragile she truly was in this wilderness, how little her presence mattered compared to the vastness of the forest and the creatures it held. Hours passed in silence. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was to point out some detail in the night. A broken branch, the sound of water in the distance, or a faint trail left by a deer. She began to notice things too, her senses sharpening in ways she had not expected. The way he read the land, how he moved without leaving a trace, how he could anticipate danger long before it became visible. She understood then that survival here was not just a matter of strength, but of understanding the language of the world around them. Despite the darkness, she began to feel a strange comfort in his presence. There was an unspoken protection, a promise that he would not let harm come to her so long as he could prevent it. And yet, even as relief washed over her, fear remained, threaded into every sound and movement. She could not shake the sense that this forest was testing her, that every shadow hid a story she was not ready to hear, and that the man who had saved her carried secrets as deep and dark as the night itself. As they settled into an uneasy routine, he spoke again, this time about the land. He told her of the seasons, of the rivers that ran swift and cold, of the creatures that roamed under the cover of trees. She listened intently, realizing that knowledge here was power, and he possessed it in abundance. He spoke not just of survival, but of respect, for the animals, for the earth, and for the unseen forces that governed the wild. She had grown up hearing tales of wilderness, of cowboys and hunters, but this was different. This was a living, breathing world, harsh and beautiful, and she was only beginning to understand the rules. He also spoke, briefly, of his people, the Apache, proud and resilient, bound to the land through generations. She felt a shiver of awe at the history carried in his voice, the weight of lives lived in rhythm with nature, lives that had endured despite the encroachment of outsiders and the relentless march of time. She did not know the details, but she sensed a depth of loyalty and strength that was almost tangible, a current running through him that connected past and present. Survival and tradition. Her stomach growled, and he offered a small smile, pulling more food from the bundle he had carried. There was a simplicity to the gesture, yet it carried something more profound than nourishment. It was a gift, a connection, a bridge between two lives that had collided by chance in the heart of the forest. She took the food carefully, savoring it, and in doing so, felt a fragile bond forming, delicate yet unbreakable if nurtured. Still, the forest did not give up its mysteries. Strange cries echoed through the darkness, and she shivered as the wind shifted, carrying scents unfamiliar and unsettling. She asked him about them, and he explained with care, telling her which sounds were animals, which were the wind through the branches, and which were signs that something, or someone, was near. Each explanation built her understanding, but it also built tension, a sense that the night was far from safe, that their presence here might be temporary unless they were vigilant. As they spoke, she began to glimpse pieces of the warrior's personality, the quiet confidence beneath his careful movements. He was not just a fighter, he was a thinker, someone who measured risks, understood consequences, and lived in harmony with the land in ways she had never imagined. Yet there were moments when his gaze drifted to the shadows, a tension in his shoulders, a flicker of something unspoken, as if memories of other nights, harder, darker, haunted him still. She realized that this man had faced dangers she could scarcely imagine. And yet here he was, calm and alert, guiding her through the forest, as though it were second nature. Night pressed on, and sleep was fleeting. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle in the distance sent her heart racing. She wanted to speak, to ask more about him, about the life he had lived before this encounter. But she knew the questions would have to wait. Trust was not built in a single evening, and the forest demanded patience and vigilance above all else. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, leaning closer to the warmth of the fire, and realized that survival here was not just about food and shelter. It was about learning, observing, and understanding a world she had never known. As the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, a faint light slipping through the dense canopy, she felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The night had tested her, sharpened her senses, and given her a glimpse of the man who had saved her. Yet there was still so much unknown. The forest had not yet released its hold, and the warrior's secrets remained just beyond her reach. She could sense them, though, the stories carried in his scars, the history written in his movements, and the unspoken burdens of his past. He rose, stretching muscles honed by years of life in the wild, and motioned for her to follow. She obeyed, stepping carefully over roots and rocks, aware that the forest still held its dangers. They moved in silence, the morning light casting long shadows and revealing paths she had not seen in the dark. Each step was a reminder that this journey had only begun, that survival was not guaranteed, and that the bond forming between them would be tested by more than hunger or cold. She stole a glance at him as he led the way. There was strength, yes, but also patience, care, and a quiet wisdom that she could not yet fully comprehend. And though she did not fully understand him, she felt drawn into his world, caught between fear and fascination, between the past she had known and a future that seemed both uncertain and inevitable. Somewhere ahead, a river whispered, a promise of water and life, yet the forest still held its mysteries. She felt the tension coil in her chest once more, the sense that danger could appear at any moment, and that the warrior who had saved her might also hold the key to understanding this untamed world. The journey had begun, and though the night had passed, the forest's challenges were far from over. She realized that the true test of survival, trust and courage, was only just beginning, and that every step forward would demand more than she had yet imagined. The river ahead gurgled softly, a gentle contrast to the tension that clung to the trees around them. She could hear the water rushing over stones, cool and clear, promising life, yet the forest still seemed alive with unseen eyes. The warrior moved ahead with fluid precision, scanning the ground, the branches, the sky, always aware of what lay beyond the immediate path. She followed as best she could, feeling the ache in her legs from the long night, the hunger still lingering, and a growing awareness that the forest had more to teach her than she had ever imagined. As they neared the riverbank, he paused, crouching low to inspect the ground. "Tracks," he said quietly, pointing to shallow impressions in the mud. "Not ours. Others passed here recently." Her pulse quickened. The forest had been quiet for hours, but now she realized silence could be deceiving. Her instincts screamed that danger was near, that whatever had left those tracks might still be watching. She tightened her grip on the thin blanket she carried, wishing she had more than bare hands to defend herself. He did not panic. He studied the tracks, tracing them with a finger, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "Hunters," he said finally, his voice low. "Or men looking for something. Or someone." She swallowed hard, realizing the implication. She was lost, alone, and vulnerable. Yet now she had drawn attention not only from the forest, but from people who might see her as prey, or worse. The thought made her stomach knot, and she felt the sharp edge of fear settle deep in her chest. They moved along the river quietly, the sound of flowing water masking their steps. He taught her to watch for signs in the terrain, how to read the broken branches, the disturbed leaves, and even the subtle shifts in the wind. She learned quickly, driven by necessity and the fear of the unknown. Every movement became a lesson, every sound a warning. She realized that survival was not simply following him, it was absorbing his knowledge, becoming part of the forest in ways she had never imagined. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher, filtering through the trees in long golden shafts. She could see his muscles flex as he carried the weight of his pack, his bow slung across his back, every motion deliberate and measured. Yet beneath the calm exterior, there was tension she could sense, a readiness for confrontation that kept her alert. She asked about it once, her voice tentative. "They are not far," he replied, eyes scanning the tree line. "Men who do not understand the forest, but they understand fear. And they follow it." He did not elaborate further, and she did not press. She had learned enough to know that some truths were dangerous, and that patience and observation were as crucial as courage. She felt a mix of relief and unease, relief at his guidance, unease at the shadow of those hunters still close behind. As they moved deeper, the landscape shifted. The forest thickened, trees growing closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to form a dense canopy. Light dimmed, and the air grew cooler, damp with moss and the scent of earth. The river narrowed, cutting through the terrain like a silver ribbon, twisting around rocks and fallen logs. She stumbled once, almost losing her footing, and he caught her wrist firmly. "Steady," he said. His voice was calm but commanding, and she realized again how fragile she was in this wild world without his guidance. While they navigated the terrain, he began to share stories of his people. Tales of resilience, of battles fought to protect their land, of families who survived through hardship and tradition. She listened, fascinated, feeling a connection to a history she had never known. There was pride in his words, a respect for the earth, and a quiet sadness for what had been lost to outsiders who did not understand or care for the ways of the land. Each story deepened her respect for him, but also heightened the tension, a reminder that the world beyond the forest was complicated, dangerous, and often cruel. She began to notice moments when his attention flickered to distant sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling, a faint murmur on the wind. Each time her heart leapt, and she realized the forest was a living challenge, filled with not just natural dangers but human ones as well. The hunters were not the only threat. Predators, terrain, and even the forest's hidden traps demanded constant vigilance. She felt her confidence grow, but so did her awareness of how much she still did not know. By midday, they reached a narrow gorge where the river tumbled over rocks into a small pool. He motioned for her to sit, and she obeyed, noticing the fatigue etched into his features even as he scanned the cliffs and surrounding forest. He produced a small bundle of dried meat and berries, sharing them silently. She understood without words that this was more than nourishment. It was preparation. Every step, every pause, was a lesson in patience, survival, and trust. While they rested, he began to trace his hand along the water, pointing out fish and the signs of life that could sustain them. She watched closely, understanding that the knowledge of the land was power, and that her survival depended on absorbing these lessons. Yet even in these moments of calm, she felt the tension of the unseen hunters, the forest's challenges, and the unspoken weight of his past pressing on them. She realized that trust was growing between them, but so was responsibility, both to each other and to the wild that surrounded them. As they moved on, the gorge gave way to dense forest once more, shadows deepening with the approaching evening. The warrior's movements grew more cautious, his eyes sharper, scanning the terrain for any sign of danger. She noticed the subtle changes, the way he shifted his weight, the quiet adjustments in his stride, the way he paused to listen to the forest's whispered warnings. She tried to mimic him, her body learning the rhythms of the wilderness, yet she knew she was still a step behind. Then, in a narrow clearing, they encountered signs of intrusion. Broken branches, footprints too large and heavy for deer, and faint echoes of voices carried on the wind. She froze, heart hammering, and he held up a hand, motioning her to stay silent. He crouched low, moving forward with the silence of a shadow, and she followed, barely daring to breathe. The hunters were close, though she could not see them. Every sense screamed danger, yet the warrior moved with certainty and skill that belied the threat. The tension in the clearing was almost unbearable. She could feel the pulse of the forest, the life that surrounded them, and the silent menace of those who tracked them. Her hunger and fatigue were forgotten, replaced by the raw awareness of survival. She realized that the journey had shifted, no longer just about finding food and shelter, but about evading human danger and understanding a world that demanded both strength and cunning. He paused, glancing back at her with a look she could not fully interpret, concern, warning, perhaps a test of her resolve. She nodded, silently promising to follow his lead, and felt the fragile bond between them grow stronger. Yet even as trust built, so did questions. Who were these hunters? What did they seek? And what secrets did the warrior carry that had prepared him for this very confrontation? The forest held the answers, but only if they could endure its challenges and the threats that lurked within. Night began to descend once more, the shadows growing long and thick. They found a small hollow beneath an ancient tree, a natural shelter that offered a brief respite. She helped gather sticks and leaves for insulation, and he checked the perimeter with the careful eye of someone who had faced countless threats. The hunters had not found them yet, but the knowledge that they were nearby cast a lingering unease over the night. Every sound, the call of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the distant splash of water, was magnified in her mind, a reminder that the forest was alive with challenges. As she settled near the fire, exhaustion pulling at her body, she glanced at him again. The warrior seemed almost untouchable, a part of the forest itself, yet she sensed layers beneath the surface, stories of loss, battles fought, and victories earned that had shaped the man she now depended on. She wanted to know more, to understand him fully, but she knew some truths were dangerous, and the forest demanded patience and observation above all else. She realized then that their survival depended on more than courage. It depended on trust, skill, awareness, and the ability to anticipate danger before it arrived. She also realized that this forest, wild and untamed, was teaching her lessons she could not have imagined, lessons of endurance, strategy, and the fragile balance between fear and hope. And as the wind whispered through the trees, carrying distant sounds and unfamiliar scents, she understood that the true challenge was only beginning. The hunters were still out there, somewhere beyond the shadows. The forest had more secrets to reveal, more tests to impose, and the warrior's past, his knowledge, his skills, and the burdens he carried, would guide them, but also challenge her. She had survived the night, but survival was only the first step. Trust, courage, and understanding would be the keys to what lay ahead, and she could feel the tension tightening like a bowstring, ready to snap. As darkness settled fully, she hugged the thin blanket around her shoulders. Watching the warrior move quietly, checking the perimeter again, she understood that nothing was certain, that every step forward carried risk, and that the forest had its own rules, indifferent to fear or desire. The river's whisper, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of animals, they all spoke of life and danger intertwined. And in that moment, she knew their journey had become a test of endurance, skill, and trust that would shape everything to come. The forest had grown almost black, a thick canopy blotting out the fading light of dusk. Every sound was amplified, the creak of branches, the distant howl of a wolf, the whisper of wind through the pines. She clutched the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, her stomach empty but her senses sharpened, each nerve straining to detect the slightest disturbance. The warrior moved ahead, silent as a shadow, his eyes scanning every movement in the darkness. He was no longer just a guide. He had become the lifeline between her and the forest, the protector who could read the subtle language of the wilderness in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Stay close," he murmured, barely audible over the rustle of leaves. She nodded, stepping carefully, trying not to break the fragile rhythm of movement he had set. Every step seemed weighted with danger. She could feel it in the tension of her muscles, in the way the air pressed down around them, as if the forest itself held its breath. The hunters were close. She knew it without seeing them, sensing the faint impressions they had left behind. The careful but impatient trail that suggested human eyes were watching. Human hands were plotting. They followed the river upstream, its water glinting faintly in the moonlight, but the path narrowed and twisted, forcing them closer to the cliffs that rose sharply on one side. The forest became a gauntlet of roots and jagged rocks, the ground slick with dampness. She stumbled once, catching herself on a tree trunk, and he was there in an instant, gripping her wrist, steadying her with firm hands. His touch was commanding yet gentle, a reminder that in this wilderness she was not entirely alone, yet entirely dependent on his knowledge and skill. "They will not give up," he said finally, voice low, almost a growl. "They follow because they want what we have, or because they fear what we represent." She shivered, realizing that the danger was not just in the forest, but in human intent. Survival meant more than moving quietly. It meant anticipating the cunning of those who did not understand the land, but were relentless in their pursuit. She tightened her grip on her meager pack, feeling the weight of her vulnerability and the strange, fierce reliance she had developed on this man who had saved her. The path grew narrower still, forcing them to hug the cliffside, the river rushing below like a ribbon of silver fire. The forest here was different, older, wilder, almost primeval. Trees bent overhead, their branches woven into an almost impenetrable lattice, and roots jutted from the earth like jagged teeth. She stepped carefully, following his lead, noting how he moved with an effortless grace, the way his footfalls landed silently, the way his eyes scanned not just the immediate ground but the surrounding shadows. Every movement was a lesson, though she was only beginning to understand it. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the trees. She froze, heart hammering. The warrior's body tensed instantly, bow in hand, eyes slicing through the darkness. "Quiet," he whispered, motioning for her to stay behind him. Another crack, closer this time, followed by a low, guttural growl. Something moved between the trees, large and deliberate, making the shadows tremble. She could barely breathe, her stomach twisting with fear and anticipation. The forest had shifted again, from a place of cautious survival to a stage for confrontation, the unknown pressing in from all sides. He moved ahead, every muscle coiled, every sense alert. She followed, heart racing, her breath shallow. The presence of the hunters grew closer, yet they remained unseen. She caught glimpses of movement, figures stepping between trees, the faint glimmer of metal reflecting moonlight. But he was always ahead, reading the landscape in ways she could not yet grasp. She felt both awe and terror. The man who had saved her was no ordinary guide. He was a force of the forest itself, and yet, she understood. He was human too, prone to risk, fatigue, and the weight of unseen burdens. The river curved sharply, forming a small gorge that funneled their path. He signaled for her to crouch, and they pressed close to the bank, hidden in the shadows. Through the thinning branches, she saw the hunters at last. 3 men, rugged and armed, their eyes scanning the forest, their movements careful but tense. They spoke in low tones, but their intent was clear. They were looking for someone. She realized with a jolt that it was her they sought, or at least she was the reason they had been drawn to this place. Her pulse jumped, a cold fear settling in her chest, and she glanced at the warrior. He was calm, yet she could sense the storm behind his eyes. A readiness to act, a plan that had not yet revealed itself. One of the hunters crouched near the river, inspecting the water as if searching for tracks. The warrior's hand went to his quiver, pulling an arrow and knocking it silently. She flinched, understanding that the moment of confrontation could come at any second. She had survived the night, the hunger, and the forest, but now the stakes had escalated. Survival was no longer just about knowledge and skill. It was about vigilance, timing, and the delicate balance of power between predator and prey, between those who knew the land and those who did not. The hunters moved cautiously, unaware of the precise danger that lingered just beyond their sight. The warrior's eyes followed every motion, his muscles coiled, ready to strike. She could feel the tension like a live wire between them, a current that threatened to snap at any moment. Every sound, The ripple of water, the rustle of leaves, the faint whistle of wind was magnified, carrying meaning she barely understood but felt deep in her bones. He motioned for her to follow, and they crept along the gorge, keeping to shadows, weaving through roots and rocks with deliberate caution. The hunters were not far behind, their presence a constant pressure, their intentions unreadable but dangerous. She felt the weight of every step, the fragile thread of safety she clung to, and the reliance on the warrior who had become both protector and teacher. The forest had grown darker, more oppressive, yet she noticed a strange rhythm in his movements, a confidence that belied the danger. As they moved, he whispered fragments of his past, lessons wrapped in stories. He spoke of times when the forest had been his only home, when every day was a test of endurance, when the hunters, or other threats, had stalked him as he now stalked them. She listened, heart racing, realizing that he had faced situations far more perilous than this, and yet he remained unbroken. Each revelation added to the suspense, a layering of danger, experience, and mystery that made her pulse quicken with both fear and fascination. The gorge narrowed further, forcing them to navigate precarious ledges and jagged rocks. Her hands were scraped and bloodied, her legs trembling with fatigue, yet she followed him without complaint. She could sense the hunters behind them, every step measured, every breath held, and the knowledge that they were closing in added a suffocating tension. The river roared below, a constant reminder of the perilous drop should they misstep, and she realized that the forest itself was part of the challenge, indifferent to their fears, testing their endurance and resolve. Suddenly, the hunters shouted, breaking the fragile silence. Her heart leapt as the warrior reacted instantly, drawing another arrow and moving with lethal precision. Shadows shifted, branches snapped underfoot, and she realized that the confrontation they had been avoiding was now unavoidable. The tension was unbearable, a knife edge poised to cut through the forest's quiet, and she clung to the warrior's skill and presence, knowing that the next moments would define everything. He moved like a shadow through the trees, silent yet deadly, positioning himself between her and the threat. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her chest, the culmination of nights spent in hunger, days in the forest, lessons in survival, and the constant lurking threat of human danger. The hunters were closing in, unaware of the skill and cunning they were up against, and she realized that the climax of this ordeal was at hand. The river, the trees, the rocks, even the wind seemed to hold their breath. She crouched low, heart hammering, watching the warrior's eyes narrow as he assessed the hunters' positions. Each arrow he notched was a message, a promise of action, a silent declaration that they would not be taken without a fight. She felt the tension coil tighter in her stomach, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and awe. The forest had tested them, taught them, and now it would witness the reckoning. A shot rang out, and the echoes bounced off the cliffs. Her pulse spiked, and she flinched at the sound, realizing that the moment they had prepared for had arrived. The hunters were no longer distant shadows. They were active, dangerous, and desperate. The warrior's movements were precise, every step calculated, yet the unpredictability of the forest, combined with human cunning, made the outcome uncertain. She knew that the next few minutes could change everything, that survival hung by a thread, and that she would have to rely entirely on the man who had rescued her, whose skills and courage now meant the difference between life and death. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the echoes of the gunshot faded, leaving only the rush of the river and the whispering wind through the pines. She pressed herself against the rough bark of a tree, heart hammering, and watched the warrior move with calm intensity. Every motion was precise, every breath measured. He had become more than a guide, more than a protector. He was the embodiment of the forest itself, attuned to its rhythms, its dangers, and its secrets. In that moment she realized she had been transformed too, no longer a lost, frightened traveler, but someone who had survived, learned, and adapted in ways she had never imagined. The hunters scrambled, disoriented by the suddenness and precision of the warrior's actions. One of them lunged forward, but an arrow whistled past, cutting a path that forced him back. Another shouted, fear breaking his composure, and she realized that the balance had shifted. The warrior was not merely defending. They were asserting the mastery of the forest over intruders, the resilience of someone who belonged to this wild, untamed place. She felt a surge of awe and gratitude, and even as fear still prickled her senses, she understood that safety had arrived, fragile but real. When the last hunter hesitated and finally fled into the shadows, she let out a long, trembling breath. The river's roar seemed louder now, filling the silence left behind, and she turned to the warrior. He lowered his bow, scanning the area one last time before finally meeting her gaze. There was relief there, but also something deeper. A quiet acknowledgement that danger had been confronted, and yet the forest itself still demanded respect. She stepped closer, feeling the weight of exhaustion, hunger, and adrenaline wash over her in waves. "You are safe now," he said softly, his voice steady but kind. It carried a reassurance that went beyond words, a promise grounded in experience and courage. She nodded, unable to speak, and for a moment, the forest seemed to settle around them, its earlier menace replaced by the gentle sounds of flowing water, rustling leaves, and distant birdsong. She realized how tightly the night's terror had gripped her and how much she had relied on him, not just for protection but for guidance, understanding, and the reassurance that survival was possible. They moved together to a small clearing near the river, where sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. The warrior knelt beside the water, washing his hands and checking the area for any remaining danger. She watched him, fascinated, realizing that his strength came not only from skill but from patience, knowledge, and a deep respect for the land. The forest had tested them both, but in surviving, they had formed a bond forged in fear, trust, and shared experience. She knelt beside him, feeling the cool water against her hands, and noticed the way he observed the river, the forest, and the sky. It was as if he were reading a language she could only glimpse, a deep understanding of the interconnectedness of life, danger, and survival. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she let silence stretch between them, comfortable now, even sacred. As the hours passed, the adrenaline faded, replaced by a quiet exhaustion. They built a small fire together, and she realized how much she had learned, not just about survival, but about trust, courage, and the strength of human connection in the face of adversity. She prepared a simple meal from the provisions he had shared, savoring the taste and warmth, feeling nourishment seep into her bones and restore her energy. He watched her with a quiet attentiveness, a patience that spoke of care without expectation, guidance without command. She began to ask about him, and slowly he shared fragments of his life. He spoke of his people, the Apache, their traditions, their resilience, and the lessons they had learned from living in harmony with the land. He told her about the challenges they had faced, the dangers of outsiders encroaching on their lands, and the importance of vigilance, respect, and adaptability. She listened intently, understanding that his past, like the forest itself, was layered with complexity, struggle, and survival. Each story deepened her admiration and her sense of connection to him, and she realized that her life had been irrevocably changed by meeting him in this wild place. Even as she learned, she sensed the lingering tension in the forest. The hunters had fled, but the memory of their pursuit lingered, a reminder that the world beyond the forest could be cruel and relentless. She asked if they might return, and he shook his head slowly. "They will go back to their homes, to their fears," he said. "The forest is ours now, but it will always demand respect. We survive because we belong to it, not because it belongs to us." She nodded, understanding the truth in his words, and felt a profound respect for the knowledge, skill, and wisdom that had guided them through the night. As the sun climbed higher, they packed up their camp and moved deeper into the forest. He guided her to areas rich with resources, teaching her how to identify edible plants, track game, and find water. She followed eagerly, learning not just from his words but from his actions, observing the careful movements, the listening, the reading of subtle signs that indicated both opportunity and danger. Each lesson strengthened her confidence, Each step deepened the bond between them, and she felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. By late afternoon, they reached a hidden grove, sunlight streaming through the tall trees in golden shafts. It was a place of beauty and calm, a refuge from the dangers that had stalked them. The warrior set up a small shelter and she helped, marveling at the way he worked with the land, using natural materials to create comfort without leaving a trace. As they rested, she realized that she was no longer just a lost wanderer. She was becoming part of this world, learning its rules, its rhythms, and its hidden strengths. He watched her quietly, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his lips, and she felt a warmth that went beyond the fire they had built. She wanted to speak, to ask if she could stay, if she could remain in this place, under his guidance, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she simply leaned against the tree, feeling the soft wind, listening to the forest, and allowing the moment to settle. It was peaceful, yet alive with energy, a reminder of the trials they had faced and the strength they had discovered in each other. As evening approached, he taught her how to start a fire using flint and dry kindling, guiding her hands with patience and encouragement. She struggled at first, but eventually a small flame caught, and she felt a surge of triumph. He nodded, approving, and she realized that her accomplishments, small as they seemed, were now tied to her growth, her resilience, and the trust she had built with him. She understood then that survival was not just about physical endurance. It was about learning, adapting, and finding strength in unexpected places. Night fell once more, but this time it felt different. The shadows were less menacing, the sounds of the forest less threatening. They sat by the fire together, sharing silence and understanding, each aware of the other's presence and importance. She felt a sense of completion, of journeying from fear to security, from helplessness to empowerment, and she realized that her life had been forever changed. The forest had tested her, the hunter had challenged her, and the man who had saved her had taught her lessons that could not be measured in words alone. As the stars appeared overhead, bright and distant, she felt a sense of peace. The hunter's world, the forest, the rivers, the mountains, was vast and untamed, yet she had found a place within it, guided by trust, courage, and human connection. She looked at him, understanding that their bond had become something deeper than survival alone, a connection forged in fear, endurance, and respect. He spoke finally, his voice calm and steady. "You have learned much. You are stronger now. The forest has taught you, as it has taught me, that life is never simple. But it is worth living with courage and respect." She nodded, understanding the full weight of his words, feeling gratitude, awe, and a profound respect for both him and the wild world they navigated together. The next morning, they left the hidden grove, following a path that led toward a small village at the edge of the forest. She carried with her the knowledge, the lessons, and the confidence she had gained, ready to face whatever lay beyond the trees. The warrior walked beside her, steady and vigilant, a guide and companion who had transformed her journey into something far greater than mere survival. She realized that life, like the forest, was unpredictable, sometimes dangerous, and always challenging, but with courage, trust, and connection. It was possible to endure, to grow, and to find strength in unexpected places. As they emerged from the forest, sunlight spilling across the clearing, she took a deep breath, feeling the warmth on her face and the rhythm of life around her. She glanced at the warrior, and in that moment, words were unnecessary. She had been lost and hungry, trapped in fear and uncertainty, and yet now she was alive, stronger, and connected to a world she had barely understood. The forest had tested them, but they had survived. Together, and in that survival, she found hope, purpose, and the beginnings of a new life. And as they walked toward the village, the sound of the river fading behind them, she knew that the journey was only the beginning. The lessons, the trust, and the bond they had forged in the forest would remain, guiding her through the challenges ahead. She had been saved by a warrior, yes, but she had also discovered the strength within herself, the resilience, courage, and wisdom that had carried her through hunger, fear, and uncertainty. And in that understanding, she felt ready for whatever life might bring, carrying the forest, the warrior and the journey within her, always top of form.